What were some of the like musculoskeletal changes that happened that enabled Homo generally and Homo sapiens in particular to be a hunter gatherer species
Yes.
to engage in the types of foraging and hunting behaviors that are typical of humans?
So what we see in humans that is very different from other mammals is that we have two key features that are quite distinct. First, we have the ability to sweat a lot. Okay, and this might seem not particularly adaptive, but there's a good reason for this. Is that humans need to well, in prolonged activities, you need to disseminate to dissipate heat. Okay, so if you're, for instance, if you're running and you're running for extended periods of time, what will happen is that your body will build up heat, and if you don't have an efficient way of evacuating this heat, you will overheat. Basically, think about a car that has no radiator. You can do so much, but at some point the car will overheat, and you'll be forced to stop. So that's the same thing with our body. So we need to evacuate this heat. Animals like cheetahs, for an example, it's a very good example of an animal that can sprint very well, that can achieve almost 100 kilometers per hour. But this animal cannot sustain prolonged activity for more than a few minutes, and then they become, they overheat. So that's one feature, this ability to dissipate, building heat. The other feature is that our locomotor muscles, so the muscles that help us to move, they're dominated by what we call slow twitch fibers, whereas most other mammals have fast twitch muscles. So these ones, the fast twitch one, are related to power. So for instance, if you need to sprint, you will use these fast twitch fibers. And what's interesting about them is that these are, they will use the stored glycogen in the muscle to fuel them. Whereas humans will use these slow twitch fibers, which are fed by our breathing. So in other words, when we run, for instance, you will note if you're running the first 30 seconds, your breath, your breathing rate will not change. That's because you're still working on the stored glycogen. But when you start to breathe heavily, that's because now you're starting to use the oxygen to help transport the glycogen to the muscles. Okay. And so that's why that's one feature that's very distinctive of humans, is that we use these slow twitch fibers way more, and we have more of them.
So you've got slow and fast twitch muscle fibers. They have different physiological properties. I would assume that most mammals probably have some amount of both, but what you're saying, it sounds like, is that humans have proportionally more of the slow twitch fibers compared to the fast twitch.
Exactly. And more relative to our close cousins too. I mean, chimpanzees, like for instance, if you're involved in a fight with a chimpanzee, your butt will be kicked. Okay, they're really, really strong, much stronger than humans, and that's because they among other reasons, that they have a lot of fast twitch muscles. Whereas humans, as I pointed out, they have these slow twitch muscles, and that allow them to run for longer with minimal use of fuel.
I see. So if you try to fight a chimpanzee head on, you're going to lose because they're way stronger, because their muscle composition and other things are different. But if you run away, you probably have a good chance of getting away.
Exactly. That's perfect. That's exactly it. Yeah.
And so if we sort of put all these things together, so we have this ability to sweat a lot, which enables us to dissipate heat. So we
Yeah.
could move around in the environment for longer without overheating. We also have more of these slow twitch muscle fibers, which are less about power and strong bursts of energy right now. And they probably enable these slow twitch fibers more long-term locomotor activity. So does this point to an enhanced ability to engage in long distance running and something that might relate to certain forms of hunting?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So these two features indicate that there was selection for stamina in humans. Okay, not power, but stamina. And there are few contexts, few activities that would require that kind of stamina. And an obvious locus of selection is hunting and possibly scavenging. So we can imagine that humans found a niche in which, running, hours and after hours after long, large prey was a locus of selection, and a niche that was not occupied by other mammals. And so that's what we think we happened with, or at least these are factors that probably contributed to the evolution of these traits in humans.
Mm-hmm. And sort of related to that, I've seen some interesting data around some of our metabolic and physiological adaptations, in particular things that have to do with our digestive system. So if you just sort of take a broad view of human digestion and metabolism, and you ask things like, what does our gut look like? How long is our GI tract? What is our stomach pH? All of these types of things. And you compare it to other mammals, herbivores versus carnivores versus scavengers. What sort of metabolic profile or digestive system would you say humans have in comparison to other mammals? And how does that maybe start to tie into some of these physical adaptations that tell us about what early humans may have been adapting to in terms of diet?
Well, that's not in my area of expertise, but some notions that I'm aware of that and I've worked on. For instance, if you think about pH, our pH is not that different from that of, let's say, of wolves, for instance, who are, noted for sometimes scavenging, and so or hyenas. So in that respect, we're not that different. Vultures have really a high pH, so these are clearly animals adapted to
low pH or high pH?
High pH, so they can sorry, low pH, so they can process these very rotten meat in a way that we cannot. And so no, sorry, low pH.
Low pH, high acidity.
Yeah, exactly. So they can tolerate very acidic things, and so that helps them to process rotten meat. And so this could also be, in some way related to our ability to use scavenging as a form of meat procurement method. So that would be one thing. Other people think that our gut became larger for processing complex carbohydrates, and that might be related, for instance, to an increasing use of plants and plants that contain toxins. The invention, or I would say the discovery of fire and the use of fire could be related to an attempt by humans to reduce toxicity of plants. And so cooking helps in this way because you can get rid of some of these toxins by this way.
Mm-hmm. When were humans first using fire?
Well, that's a very controversial problem. I would say there's a safe answer. The safe answer is that at least 400, maybe 500,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. Now, there's another answer which suggests there might be some evidence for use, but I would say on an occasional basis, maybe ad hoc basis, and that could go as far as some say 2 million years ago. So steady, consistent use of fire is recent, 500, maybe no more than 500,000 years old. But regular, occasional use could have occurred a little bit earlier. But again, that's debated. And one reason it's because many fires might have been very ephemeral, and they might not leave archaeological signatures that are quite robust.
I see. So we know it's at least a certain amount of years old, and it might be older, but we just can't detect it, or humans weren't using it frequently yet.
Yeah, and it might have varied regionally. It's just that by 400,000 years ago, we're fairly certain that it's being mastered in many regions of the world, and that it's a habitual behavior.
Mm-hmm. And is that unique to Homo sapiens, or did other species of Homo have fire as well?
Well, we see it in Neanderthals. Some see it as a different species, some as a subspecies. So that depends on your view. Homo erectus, if we say 500,000 years ago, that would be Homo erectus. So, we can imagine that it's, was used by several species. For instance, we know of the hobbit, the so-called hobbit in Southeast Asia. It's unclear yet if they use fire but that would be another species.
Mhm. So humans have these adaptations that enabled stamina. We could run long distances. We could dissipate heat efficiently. We had the muscle composition that enabled all of that. It's presumably related to food procurement, whether that's active hunting or scavenging. For these early humans in Africa in the Paleolithic, do we have any evidence, any good evidence as to the types of creatures that they were hunting or scavenging, the types of meat they were eating, or anything like this?
Yeah, so we know what range of species they're hunting. So if we go back 2 million years ago, it seems that they are already able to procure some large game, such as gemsbok or hartebeest, or and some smaller ones, probably dikers. These animals were probably in the range of what they could acquire. Elands are also thought to be sometimes acquired. But there's some debate about the larger range, the larger game. Something they were probably scavenged more frequently than eaten. But so it's unclear. But at least for the medium size animals, something like maybe a gemsbok, that seems to have been in the range of what humans could acquire. For those who are unfamiliar with these species, James Bach would be about the size of, let's say, a caribou in North America.
Like a big deer.
Yeah, so a big deer. Yeah.
And do we know, like, when these early humans were hunting, was meat like that? Was it an occasional treat that they would get whenever they could? Was it a very was it a staple of the diet? How, like, what proportion of the diet came from hunting? And do we know very much about, like, the full composition of these early human diets?
That's very difficult to answer. We think that if they show up in the archaeological record, it means it's more than occasional.
Mm-hmm.
But whether this is a staple, that remains to be, determined. We have quite a few evidence, that they're, like we have slice marks or tool marks on bones that suggest they're using different species. We know they're extracting marrow very early on. By 2.5 million years ago, they're already extracting marrow. In fact, that might have been one of the main incentive to hunt these animals, to get fat, because marrow is full of fat. So fat is often more important in modern foragers than the acquisition of meat, actually.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's hard to get a lot of direct evidence for this stuff, but we have things like bones with cut marks, and it's common enough that when you see it in the archaeological record, it couldn't have been rare, because otherwise we just wouldn't find artifacts like that. Are there also indirect sort of measures of this type of thing? So, for example, I know that when you look at cave art, a disproportionate amount of the cave art seems to be centered on animals that presumably would have been hunted, and that would suggest that perhaps it was quite common.
Yes, there's cave art, but before we address cave art, there is also some isotopic studies. So when you eat certain animals or certain types of resources, you will acquire some isotopes through the tissue. And this might, be detected by looking at and by extracting collagen from the bones. You might be, we're able to make some inferences. So we know when we look at early hominins, it looks more like they're eating plants. The acquisition, or at least the procurement of game, seems clear in Neanderthals. So it seems to be in fact, Neanderthals have been described as a hyper-carnivore, which is probably, a stretch, but they're definitely, having meat on a regular basis. So probably I would say 500,000 years ago, humans eat meat on a regular basis. Now, with respect to cave art, the oldest cave art is about 50, maybe 55, 60,000 years ago, 60,000 years old. And what we find, the earliest ones are not depictions of animals. They're often dots or hand stencils. So the cave art with representation of animals slightly younger, maybe 40,000 years ago. And, we see a range of animals. Often they are spectacular ones. We have bisons, cave lions, stuff like that. And whether this indicates that people are trying to acquire these animals or they are somewhat scared by these animals or trying to acquire the power of these animals is, of course, a matter of a debate. And the true meaning of this cave art remains a little bit nebulous to us. But what's interesting is that when you look at the skills that are shown in these things, early on they look like, Leonardo da Vinci. They often, some of them are really already beautiful and spectacular.
So it sounds like the earliest hominids were eating mostly plants, maybe occasional meat. So, in broad terms, probably not that different from something like, great apes like chimpanzees, mostly plants, but some animal-based foods. And then as our lineage emerged, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, we had these adaptations that allow, we had bigger brains happening. We had the ability to have more stamina evolving. That unlocked the ability to hunt. And so meat became more important in our diet than it was for other apes, but we're still eating an omnivorous diet.
Yes. What's important to emphasize, and this point is sometimes overlooked, is that chimpanzees and bonobos, which are our closest ancestors, they both hunt. They don't hunt very frequently, but they will hunt, especially red colobus monkey, sometimes duikers, which are small antelopes. They can acquire turtles, so they can hunt, and they're successful to some extent. It's highly variable regionally. Some population will hunt more frequently than others, but it's there. Until maybe 20 years ago, it was thought to be extremely marginal, and now there's some evidence that in some population, it's I would say a treat, something not common, but it's definitely there. So in other words, humans are not qualitatively different in that respect from the apes and bonobos. It's more the extent and the size of the animals that we capture that is different. No chimps will capture something as big as a caribou.
And that's probably simply because they don't have physiological adaptations that enable them to catch an animal like that.
Yes, and also because they don't use tools for that, or they use very similar, it's not exactly true. They do use some tools, but often it's for acquiring, the tissue itself. So they might bang a tortoise on a tree to open it and stuff like that. Or there's some suggestion sometimes they may be using stones, but it's unclear, to what extent they use tools. But overall, when we look at them, it's mostly catching by the hand, which limits what you can do. Humans use projectiles, they use snares, they use traps and other methods that allow us to overtake prey that are much larger than ourselves.